Welcome back to another M language tutorial. Yeah. So we're going to jump back into this wonderful language. We kind of introduced it a couple videos ago. Let's say like 2 or 3 weeks ago, if my memory serves me correctly. In the previous videos, a lot of it, again, was just getting us comfortable with the environment, just getting us comfortable with the idea of how the M language was built, how it operates, just things we need to know along that nature. And then additionally, we started exploring the different types of data types that exist in the M language. And so we've covered like the very traditional types like boolean, strings, and all that kind of fun stuff, and things along that nature. We're going to jump into kind of one of our first structured data types, which is a record. So you will probably be working with records a lot depending on the type of data source that you're working with. So for example, JSON files, that's a really big topic when it comes to Power Query, and most of the time you're going to be working with records in with a JSON file. So to kind of give us some context, naturally, some people will be asking, what is a record? Well, a record is just simply a set of fields. A field is a name value pair where the name is a text value that is unique within the fields, well, within the field's records, and then the value is the value that is actually associated with that particular name. And so the syntax for record values allow the names to be written without quotes, a form also referred to as identifiers. An identifier can take the following two forms. So identifier name, such as order ID, and then identifier name, such as today's data is, XYZ. So at this point, all you really need to know is that a record is simply a collection of fields, where a field is simply a name value pair, where the name is a unique key within your record, and then the value is just simply the value that you have associated with that name. So if you want to define just a record on its own inside of Power Query, it's pretty straightforward. It's just obviously the name of the step. So in this case, or in the sense the variable, it would be my record equals, use square brackets, and so square brackets denote records, and then it's simply the field name, and so in this case my first record field is called name, and then equal sign, and then simply the value that you want associated with that particular field name. And so in this case, I'm associating a string with my name, and it's being assigned to the field called name. If you want multiple fields inside of your record, you simply separate each of the name value pairs by a comma. And then so after you've added a comma, you can add another field name and then have that field name equal to some value. So this is a very basic record. I try to show you that you can obviously have different data types in these records. You could also have a record within a record. There's nothing really stopping you from doing that. We've seen that in previous videos and things along that nature. From here, what I'm going to show you is, first I'm going to show you what this looks like after we've kind of populated it, and then we're going to just start going through some functions that you might be using with a record data type. So nothing super complicated in this video. I think most of it's pretty straightforward for the most part, but it's really important that you understand how to manipulate these items if you need to. So I'm going to close out of this, and then I'm going to maximize this actually. So you can see right here that once I have a record, records are pretty easy to identify because the field names are on the left side and they're almost like the row names, and then the value associated with that one, with that particular field name, is just simply the actual cell right there. And you can see right here on the right hand side that I do have all the steps typed out. So basically what we're going to be doing is just kind of going step by step, and I'm going to try to show you exactly what's going on up here. And so the first thing that we can do to a record is we can add a field. And so all we would do is we would take whatever object we're going to be passing through. So in this case, it does have to be a record, obviously, because you're going to be manipulating that record. And then what you can do with the add field function is you specify the name of the field that you want to add to it. And then you specify the value that you want to be associated with that field name. And so in this case, I just provided my hometown, which is San Diego. And so what that does is it adds that new field and then associates that new value with that new field. So if we can add a field, naturally you would think we can remove a field. We can, yes. So for example, if I wanted to, I could remove fields and I can specify the field that I want to remove. So in this case, I'm removing my gender. And with that one, you can see that the output is just simply removing that field. Now, I did want to show you that if you want to remove multiple fields at once, it would just be a list of the field names. So that's pretty standard if you're going to work with anything that has fields at the end. So if it has an S at the end, more than likely what you're going to have to pass through is a list of the field names. So just keep that in mind as you go forward if you want kind of like a little shortcut that you can add to your head. So that's deleting a field. So you just pass through the field name that you want to delete. We can also rename fields. So in this case, I'm changing the field name to first name. And so again, this is also a list. And so that list, the first value is the original field name, and then the second value is the new field name. And so obviously if you wanted to do multiple fields at once, it would be a list of list. We can also reorder fields. So for example, if I want first name, then age, then college degree, then hometown, then salary, I'm completely allowed to do that. Again, that's just passing through a list of all the field names where each field name is separated by a comma. And then obviously any of these functions, it is expecting that you're passing through a record. Because if you were to pass through a list, for example, it would say, wait a minute, you're trying to convert a list. You're basically trying to like make a list a record or something like that. And it's just going to throw off an error. Doesn't mean you can't do it, but you would have to do that conversion as you're passing it through, something like that. We can also combine records, which is pretty cool. So if you want, what you can do is you can, and this one's kind of a little bit tricky, you call record.combine, and then you pass through a list of the records that you want to combine. So I'm just taking the one that I had reordered in the last step, and then separate that by a comma, and then I pass through another record. And so in this case, the second record has my birthday, and then it has my favorite color. So at this point, what it does is it now merges the two together, and you have basically a merged record set that has two extra fields that it didn't have before. You can also transform the fields. So for example, you might want to change the actual data type that exists in a particular record. So you can do that with the record.transform fields. And in this case, what I'm doing is I'm actually converting the data type of multiple fields. So here I'm making this one a text, this one is a number, this one is a logical one, text, decimal, from text, and then a text as well. So all this is doing is it's just converting it to the proper data type. So if you wanted to do additional types of transformation, usually you always want to make sure that you're working with the proper data type. Additionally, it is also important to know that, again, we are just passing through a list of lists where each list inside of that outer list is simply the field name and then the type of conversion that you want to do with it. So we can also get the field values. So if I say record.fieldValues, that will return all the field values for a given record. And so in this case, I basically have a list of just all the individual values. So this is important to know that what is returned back to you is a list of all the field values. You can also return a list of all the field names. And so if you do record.fieldNames, you can get back all of the field names. So again, how you would use it, Kind of really depends on the situation, but it is good to know that it is there if you wanted to make some very, complicated queries that really depended on some pretty, deep logic. And so here, I'm kind of going through the process of selecting records. And so I'll probably just jump back into Power Query to show you this one. So this is just selecting fields from a record. And so if you select a field, it does return back the value. There's multiple ways to select a field. Probably the easiest one is you just surround the field name with the actual square brackets. And once you do that, you now have the value that it's associated with that field. Additionally, you could also select a single field by using the record.field, where you pass through your record object, and then you pass through the field as a string that you want to return, so the value that you want to return from that field. If you want to select multiple fields at once, then you can do record.selectFields, so S at the end. You pass through your record object, and then you pass through a list of all the fields that you want to return back. And so with this one, again, it's a list. And to kind of show you what it looks like, that's me selecting my name. It's kind of hard to tell, but it's right there. There's my age, and there's my age and name. And then also keep in mind, if you select multiple fields at once, it does return back a record as well because you have multiple fields, where each one of these ones might return back a single value. So at that point, you're working with a specific data type. So in this case, I'm working with a text. This one, I'm working with numbers. This one, I'm working with a record. I can also check and see if my record has a field. So for example, if I want to see if my record has a field called first name, then I can pass through the name of that field. And if it returns true, it means that field exists. And if it does not exist, then obviously would come back false. You can also do multiple fields at once. Again, that would be just a list of the field names. And here I'm showing you how to do that with multiple fields. So if you want to see, hey, does it have first name and favorite book? Then it returns false because there isn't a favorite book in there. So important to keep in mind, this one's kind of all of them have to match, or I'm just going to send back false. So even though they have 2 out of 3 are matching, because that last one's not matching, it's going to return back false. So I can also convert my record to a list. This is a common transformation you're probably going to do, but you can see right here, all it does is it takes all those field values and it converts the field values into a list. It does not take the field names. That's important to keep in mind. It only takes the field values. I can also do record to table. So in this example, it would keep the field names and the field values. So you'll have one column that contains all the field names, and then you'll have a second one that contains all the field values. Be a little bit careful with this because normally if you return back a record, you're probably going to have mixed data types. Not always, but it's usually pretty safe to assume it's going to be mixed. So more than likely your column is going to be a mix of different data types. So going forward, it might be a little bit challenging to do certain transformations. So you would probably have to do some more cleanup before you actually started doing any real type of transformation. But it is good to know that it's there for you in case you want to do some type of transformation. On a side note, I didn't know this because I haven't used Power Query in a while. They have this nice little feature that will tell you if they're all valid fields and errors and empties. Like, I thought this was so cool. And this little like highlight at the top will actually tell you the percentage that is, I guess, like errors or something like that. It's pretty cool. I mean, they're really making Power Query like fun to work with. If anything, it's colorful. All right. So a nice little, this is a kind of a good to know just in case, again, you're trying to do some transformation, you just don't want it to break right away. So there's a function called field or default, which is basically what's going to happen is if that field that you're looking for doesn't exist, it just simply returns back a null value. In some cases, that might be a really good step to have in mind because otherwise it's going to break and it's going to say there's a syntax error and everything like that. Sometimes you definitely want that error to pop up, but other times you don't necessarily want that to happen. You just want it to kind of say like, "Oh, okay, that's fine. Just put a null value." So the record.field or default function is a really good tool where you just want to replace the value with a null if it doesn't exist. Now, additionally, you can also add in an extra parameter which basically says, well, if that field doesn't exist, what do you want the default value to be? If you don't pass in anything, the default value is null. But if you do pass through a value, so that would be your third argument, then that is the default value. So in this case, I don't have a field called favorite book. But when I use the field or default function and I pass through the default value if it doesn't exist, then what is returned back to me is that default value. So basically what I had is I said, hey, if the favorite book field doesn't exist, then just return back Star Wars. So going forward, what is this one? Select fields. Oh, yes. This one we're going to have to go back in Power Query. So this is a little bit confusing, but again, it's kind of good to know. So this is like a default, well, this is like an optional value that you can pass through with pretty much any of the field functions. So there's an optional parameter called missing fields, and depending on what you set that to, the default behavior of that function will change. So for example, by default, we have it set to missing field error. And so an optional parameter in record and table functions indicating that missing field should result in error. This is the default parameter value. So if you don't set this value, then by default, if a record is missing, if a field is missing, it will automatically return an error unless you're doing a very specific function. However, you can have this particular behavior be applied to all sorts of different functions. The alternative option is missing field ignore. So in this case, it just ignores missing field, so it doesn't do anything to it. It just kind of like skips over it. The other option is use null. And so in this case, what will happen is it will simply replace that value with a null value if it doesn't exist. So I try to put some examples down here. So I have an expression, my age, name, and then I'm changing the default behavior to missing field use null. And so this one should return back a null value, which luckily it does. And so you can see it does return back that field. And it's actually kind of interesting too, because again, I didn't do select fields or default or anything like that. I just did select fields. And so even though this field didn't exist, it still had it set as a null. So again, it's just an option for you. It doesn't necessarily do anything unless you kind of want it to. Here I'm using the ignore. So ignore, it just says like, okay, whatever, I don't care. So 2 returns a null. And then obviously if we put the default behavior, it comes back with this, which is like, hey, there's a glaring error. So again, good tool to know that's available, because sometimes the data you're going to be working with, they're not going to necessarily have all the same fields, especially when you're working with JSON data. I can tell you multiple times where you probably will not have all the fields. So it's good to know that behavior and use it when necessary. So with that being said, though, that actually does conclude our video. So if you have any questions about how to use fields and records and value names and all that kind of fun stuff, please put them down in the comments below and I will try to get back to you. And then also, if you could, please make sure to like the video, because we always appreciate the support. And if you're not already, please make sure to subscribe to the channel so that way you get regular updates as we cover more topics in the M language reference. So thank you again for watching, everybody. In our next video, we're going to be covering how to work with different data sources. See you soon.